She fainted in front of the Mafia boss and exposed a secret she tried to hide but couldn't anymore. The documents were going to get her killed. Sophia knew this, the way you know a storm is coming before you see the clouds. You feel it in your chest. You feel it in the way your hands won't stay still no matter how hard you press them flat against your thighs. She pressed them flat now, standing in the back corridor of the Hotel Meridian, 4th floor, East Wing, where the carpet was thick and the walls were paneled in dark wood, and the guests who stayed here did not use credit cards. They paid in envelopes. They arrived without luggage. They left before sunrise. Sophia had worked the night shift at this hotel for 3 years. She knew every corridor, every back staircase, every linen closet and service elevator. She knew which rooms were booked under false names and which ones had their minibar removed before check-in to make space for other things she had no interest in knowing about. She had built her survival here on a single principle: see nothing, say nothing, stay employed. Tonight, that principle was about to fail her completely. Her colleague Rena had called in sick 2 hours ago. Rena worked the private events wing, a separate section of the 4th floor that required a different key card and a different kind of nerve. Sophia had been asked to cover. She had said yes because she needed the extra hours. She needed the money. She always needed the money, and that particular need had a way of making a person agree to things they would later regret. She was already regretting it. The private wing was quiet in the way that expensive places are quiet. Not peaceful, just controlled. Every sound that existed here had been permitted to exist. The hum of the ventilation system, the soft click of her shoes on the corridor floor, the distant murmur of male voices behind the 3rd door on the left, room 412, which was listed in the booking system under the name Castellano Events, and which had been occupied since 9 o'clock that evening. Her job was simple. She was supposed to deliver a tray of bottled water and fresh glasses, knock twice, leave the tray on the table just inside the door, and go. 40 seconds. She had done it 100 times in other parts of the hotel. It required nothing from her, except the ability to be present without being noticed. She picked up the tray from the service station at the end of the corridor. The bottles were cold. The glasses clinked against each other as she lifted the tray, and she steadied it with both hands, and walked to room 412 and knocked twice. No one answered. She knocked again. Still nothing. She pressed her ear to the door. The voices had stopped. She pulled back, checked the corridor, checked the time on the small clock above the service station. It was 11:42. She was supposed to have delivered this tray at 11:30. She was already late. She could not leave without delivering it. Leaving it outside the door was not an option, not in this wing, not with these guests. She used the service keycard to open the door. The room was not empty. It held a long rectangular table, 12 chairs, and 11 men. The 12th chair was empty. The table was covered in papers and folders and 2 open laptops, and every single man in that room turned to look at her at exactly the same moment, the way a flock of birds turns in the sky, all at once, without signal. Her brain registered 3 things in rapid sequence. First, these were not ordinary hotel guests having an ordinary meeting. Second, she had just walked into something she was never supposed to see. Third, at the far end of the table, standing with both hands resting flat on the surface and looking at her with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who had never once been caught off guard in his life, was Luca Ferrante. She knew his face. Everyone in Naples knew his face, the same way they knew the face of the cathedral and the face of the harbor. He was as much a part of the city's geography as either of those things, and just as permanent, and just as indifferent to whoever came and went beneath him. The newspapers called him the architect, not because he had ever studied architecture, because of the precision with which he constructed and dismantled things. Businesses, arrangements, problems, people, when necessary, though that last part was never written directly. It was implied. Everything about Luca Ferrante was implied. That was how he had lasted this long in a world where directness was a liability. Sophia stood in the doorway with a tray of water in her hands and looked at him. He looked back. She became aware, in a slow and terrible way, that her jacket had come open at some point during the walk down the corridor, and that the papers she had been carrying against her body, folded inside the inner pocket, were now partially visible, just the edge of them, just enough. She had been carrying those papers for 11 days. She took a step backward toward the door. Her vision went white at the edges. the way it does when the body decides, without consulting the mind, that the current situation exceeds its capacity. She felt the tray leave her hands. She heard the glasses hit the floor, and then the floor came up to meet her. She woke on her back, staring at a ceiling that was very far away and very white, and had a small decorative molding running along its edge that she had never noticed before from this angle. A voice said, "Give her room." The shoes moved back. There had been shoes, many of them, expensive, a forest of them around her head, and now they moved back, and the ceiling had more space in it. She became aware of fingers on her wrist. 2 fingers, pressed precisely against the inside of her wrist, neither gentle nor rough, just accurate, clinical, checking her pulse the way a doctor checks it, not the way a person checks it. She turned her head. Luca Ferrante was crouched beside her on the floor of room 412, his jacket still perfectly buttoned, his expression carrying the particular blankness of someone who has decided not to react until they have more information. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "You're back," he said. It was not a question. It was not comforting. It was simply an observation, delivered in the same tone you might use to confirm that a package had arrived. Sophia tried to sit up. His free hand moved to her shoulder, not pushing her back down, just resting there, a suggestion of stillness. "Slowly," he said. She sat up slowly. The papers from her jacket were on the floor between them, scattered when she fell. 3 folded sheets and a smaller envelope, all of them fanned out across the expensive carpet like something that had decided, on its own, that the time for hiding was finished. Luca's eyes moved to them. She watched him look at them. She watched his jaw do something small and controlled, a shift, barely visible, the kind of movement a face makes when a mind is recalculating something very quickly. He reached out and picked up the top sheet. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. "Get her a chair," he said, quietly, to the room, and closed the door. Sophia sat in the chair they brought her and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that the life she had been living for the past 11 days, the careful, suspended, breath-held life of a woman carrying a secret that was too large for her body, was over. The secret was on the floor. And Luca Ferrante was already reading it. She did not beg. She did not explain. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and waited, because the only thing left to do now was to see what kind of man he actually was, beneath the newspapers and the implications, and the face that half of Naples recognized, and the other half pretended not to. The room was very quiet. 11 men stood along the walls, and none of them spoke, because when Luca Ferrante read something in silence, the room understood that silence was the appropriate response. He finished the 3rd page. He set it down with the others, aligned them with one hand, the way you align documents before filing them. He looked at Sophia. "Who are you?" he said. Not threatening, not loud, simply the first necessary question. She told him her name. He waited, and Sophia Reyes, who had spent 3 years being invisible in this hotel, and 11 days carrying a dead man's last act of love, opened her mouth and began to tell him everything. She had been lying for 3 weeks, and she was tired in the bone-deep way that only liars understand. It is a specific tiredness. It lives in the muscles behind the eyes, and in the back of the throat, and in the small persistent ache of maintaining a version of yourself that does not match the actual contents of your chest. She told him about Matteo. Not the documents first. Matteo first, because without Matteo none of the rest of it made any sense. Her brother had been 3 years older than her and had laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, which drove her insane, which she would give anything in the world to hear one more time. He had been terrible with money and brilliant with people, and he had made one decision, 8 years ago, that had cost him everything, and eventually cost him his life, though not in the way anyone who heard that sentence would assume. The decision had been simple and stupid and born entirely out of love. Their father had owed money to men who collected debts with a patience that was more frightening than anger. When the debt reached a number their father could not manage and their father's health was already failing, Matteo had done what older brothers do. He had stepped in. He had made arrangements. He had entered a world he had no experience with and no temperament for, and he had served that world faithfully for 8 years, because the alternative was a visit to their father that he could not bear to think about. He had worked for a man named Carlo Vesto, who worked for a man named Pietro Lanza, who worked, according to the documents on the floor of room 412, for a network of interests that included, among other things, 3 of the men currently standing along the walls of this room. Sophia watched Luca's face when she said that. Nothing moved in it. She continued. Matteo had not been a collector. He had not been an enforcer. He had been an accountant by training, and the world he had entered had needed accountants desperately, because money that cannot be counted and tracked and moved quietly is just paper, and paper without structure is worthless. Matteo had been good at his job, too good in the end, because men who are good at moving money see things that men who move money for dishonest reasons would prefer no one saw. He had started keeping records 2 years ago, not out of any plan, out of fear. He had a daughter named Giada who was 6 years old, and who called him Papa in the way that 6-year-olds do, with complete faith in the permanence of the thing, and he had looked at her one afternoon and understood, with the sudden clarity that only parents understand, that he was not permanent, that the world he operated in consumed men like him, that Giada was going to need something after he was gone, and that something had to come from somewhere. And the only currency Matteo had accumulated in 8 years of keeping other people's books was information. So he had kept records of his own. Dates, names, account numbers, transfers, instructions received and instructions followed. 2 years of it, organized with the meticulous care of a man who knew that the value of a document is entirely dependent on whether it can be understood and verified by someone who wasn't there. Then he had gotten sick. Not suddenly. Cancer is not sudden, despite what people say. It arrives quietly and establishes itself with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. And by the time Matteo understood what was happening in his body, the thing had already been living there for over a year. He had told Sophia on a Tuesday morning in March, in the kitchen of her apartment, while she made coffee, and he sat at the table with his hands folded in front of him, like a man at a business meeting who happens to be delivering the worst news of both their lives. She had not cried. Not then. She had set the coffee down and sat across from him and said, "What do we need to do?" He had looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to do something for me," he said. After. She had said yes before he finished the sentence, because that is what you do when someone you love asks you for something, and because she had known her brother for 31 years and had never once refused him anything that mattered. He had explained the documents. He had explained who they implicated and why they were dangerous and why they had to reach one specific person and no one else. He had been very clear about this last point. He had repeated it 3 times, looking at her with the focused intensity of a man who does not have enough time left to say anything twice. Not Carlo, not Pietro, not anyone in the organization, only Ferrante, directly, no intermediary. Why Ferrante? She had asked. Because the men in these documents are working against him. They are using my books, my name, the accounts I managed, to build something that will eventually be used to remove him. He is the only one with both the reason and the ability to stop it, and if he stops it, Giada is protected. He is a man who pays his debts, even ones that were never formally agreed to. You've never met him. I've worked 3 levels below him for 8 years. I know more about him than I know about most people I've had dinner with. He honors what is owed. That is not a small thing in the world I've been living in. Matteo had died 11 days after that conversation. Sophia had attended the funeral, held her niece Giada's hand while the child stood in a black coat that was slightly too large for her, and stared at the closed casket with an expression of incomprehension that Sophia felt in every part of her body. She had gone home afterward and sat in her apartment and looked at the envelope her brother had given her, which she had placed in the center of her kitchen table, and she had understood that the grief and the task were going to have to exist at the same time, because one could not wait for the other. She had spent 11 days trying to find a way to reach Luca Ferrante directly, 11 days of phone numbers that went nowhere, of contacts who went silent the moment she mentioned his name, of doors that closed before she could finish a sentence. He was everywhere in the city, and completely unreachable, the way certain kinds of powerful men are, not hidden, just insulated, layers of people between themselves and the world. And then Rena had called in sick, and the hotel had asked Sophia to cover the private events wing. And here she was, sitting in a chair in room 412, with 11 men along the walls, and the documents on the carpet between her and a man who was watching her, with an attention so complete, it felt almost like pressure. When she finished speaking, the room was silent. Luca looked at the documents. He looked at Sophia. Something moved in his face. Not quite what she would call warmth. More like the shift that happens in a room when a window opens. Just a fraction. Just enough to change the quality of the air. "Your brother told you to come to me," he said. "My brother told me you were a man who pays what he owes. He believed that included debts he named for you, even ones you hadn't agreed to yet." Luca was quiet for a moment. "That is either a tremendous act of faith," he said, "or a tremendous act of desperation." "It was both," Sophia said. "He was dying. He didn't have the luxury of choosing only one." Luca stood. He picked up the documents from the floor, all of them, and aligned them in his hand with that same single gesture of careful, unhurried order. He walked to the long table and set them down beside the laptop and stood with his back to the room for a moment. Then he turned. "The names in these documents," he said, to no one specifically, in a voice that was completely even, "are names some of you may recognize." The room shifted. Not physically. The men did not move. But something changed in the quality of their stillness. The way water changes quality, when something cold drops into it. 3 of the men along the wall looked at the floor. Luca noticed. He noticed everything. "Francesco," he said, to the man standing nearest the window, "take our guest to room 208, the good one." He paused. "And send Enzo up." He looked at Sophia. "You are not a prisoner here. I want you to understand that clearly. You are a guest, and guests at this hotel are treated with respect." A pause. "You have my word on that. And if your brother's assessment of me was correct, you know what that means." Sophia stood. Her legs were steadier than she expected. "He also said you were the most careful man he had never met," she said. He meant it as a compliment. Something crossed Luca Ferrante's face then, fast and unguarded, the kind of expression that arrives before a person can decide whether to allow it. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, present for less than a second, and then gone. "Get some rest," he said. She followed Francesco out of room 412 and into the corridor, and behind her, she heard Luca begin speaking to the room in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, and she did not hear the words, and she did not want to. She had done what her brother asked. She had found a way to reach Luca Ferrante directly. She had not planned on fainting. She had not planned on any of it. But Matteo had always said that the best plans were the ones that survived contact with reality. And this one, improbably, spectacularly, in the worst possible way, had survived. Giada would be taken care of. That was the only thing that mattered tonight. Sophia walked down the corridor of the Hotel Meridian and did not look back. And in room 208, which was indeed the good one, she sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than her monthly rent, and pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and, for the first time in 11 days, allowed herself to cry. The room on the 4th floor had a window that overlooked the harbor. Sophia had discovered this at 5 in the morning when she could not sleep, and had pulled back the curtains and found the sea sitting there in the early dark, flat and gray and indifferent, lit at the edges by the lights of fishing boats heading out before sunrise. She had not slept. Not because the room was uncomfortable. It was the most comfortable room she had ever been in, but because comfort and the ability to sleep are not always related. Her mind had spent the night reviewing the previous evening in the obsessive, recursive way the mind does when it is trying to determine whether a decision that cannot be undone was the right one. She had walked into that room. She had fainted. The documents had fallen. She had told a man who controlled a significant portion of Naples' shadow economy that 3 members of his own organization had been using her dead brother's financial records to build a case against him. These were not the actions of a person who had managed to stay invisible for 3 years. The knock at the door came at 7 in the morning. She opened it expecting Enzo, the large and quiet man who had been stationed outside her door the previous night, and who communicated primarily through a series of small nods that apparently covered the full range of necessary conversation. It was not Enzo. Luca Ferrante stood in the corridor in a dark jacket that was different from the one he had worn the night before, holding 2 cups of coffee. one in each hand, with the particular composure of a man who had not slept either, and was refusing to allow that fact to be legible in his face. He held out one of the cups. She took it. He looked at the window behind her, at the harbor and the gray sea and the fishing boats she had been watching. "May I come in?" he said. It was not a formality. He was genuinely asking. That was the part that surprised her. She stepped back from the door. He came in and stood by the window and drank his coffee, and looked at the harbor for a moment without speaking. There was something almost ordinary about it. Two people with coffee and a view, except that nothing about the situation was ordinary and both of them knew it. "The documents your brother kept," he said, still looking at the window. "I need you to understand what they contained." "I know what they contained," Sophia said. "I read them. Matteo made sure I understood everything before he gave them to me." Luca turned from the window. "Then you know that 3 of the men in that room last night have been routing funds through accounts that carried your brother's name, accounts they controlled, but that were registered in his identity." "Yes. If anything in those arrangements had ever come to legal attention, your brother would have appeared to be the architect of it, not them." "I know." He had been carrying that for 2 years. He knew, Sophia said. He understood exactly what position he was in. That was why he kept his own records. Parallel records. Everything they did, documented from his side, showing the chain of instruction, showing that the decisions came from above him, not from him. Luca was quiet for a moment. He was protecting himself. He was protecting Giada. If anything happened to him, and the legal attention came later, he needed there to be a record that cleared his name, so that she didn't inherit his reputation along with his absence. Luca set his coffee down on the small table near the window. He looked at Sophia with the complete, unhurried attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things he was thinking seriously about. It was not intimidating exactly. It was thorough. It was the look of a man who did not make decisions based on incomplete pictures. "I am going to honor what your brother asked," he said. "I want to say that clearly. Before anything else, Giada will be provided for. Education, housing, a fund established through structures that are clean and legal and cannot be challenged. Your brother named a figure in the letter. That figure will be met." Sophia had been holding the coffee cup with both hands. She felt the warmth of it against her palms, steady and real, and she focused on that for a moment, because the alternative was to let the relief arrive all at once, and she was not sure she could manage that gracefully. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. "I owe it," Luca said simply. "Your brother worked within a system that used him. He was not a willing participant in any meaningful sense. He was a man trapped by a debt he inherited, and trying to protect what he could. The least I can do is make sure that protection holds after he no longer can." Sophia nodded. Then he said, "I also need to ask something of you. Not require. Ask." She had been waiting for this. "The men named in your brother's documents know he had a sister. They do not know the documents exist. They do not know you came here last night. But the situation I now have to address is not a simple one, and until it is resolved, you are connected to it in a way that creates risk for you." "You want me to stay?" "I am asking you to consider staying. Here, in the hotel, as a guest, for a period of approximately 2 weeks. Until the matter is resolved and the people who might have reason to look for those documents understand that looking is no longer useful." Sophia walked to the window. The fishing boats had moved further out. The harbor was brightening now, the gray becoming silver as the sun found it. 2 weeks in a hotel room, away from her apartment, her work, her routine, away from the careful, invisible life she had constructed over 3 years. She thought about Matteo sitting at her kitchen table with his hands folded. She thought about Giada in the oversized black coat. She thought about 11 days of carrying paper against her ribs and the specific weight of a secret that belongs to someone who is no longer alive to carry it themselves. "Who would cover my shifts?" she said. Something in Luca's face shifted. Not quite surprise. The nearest thing to it he apparently allowed himself. "I will see to it that your employment and income are not affected." "And Enzo stays outside the door?" "Enzo or someone equally capable." "Yes." Sophia turned from the window. 2 weeks, she said. Luca Ferrante picked up his coffee cup from the table and looked at her over the rim of it. 2 weeks, he confirmed. He left her to the harbor and the morning and the coffee that was cooling in her hands, and Sophia stood at the window of the most expensive room she had ever occupied and understood that she had just agreed to something that was significantly more complicated than the words 2 weeks suggested. But Matteo had trusted this man's sense of what was owed. And Matteo, despite everything, had never once been wrong about a person. She drank her coffee. Outside, the harbor filled with light. The days that followed had a rhythm she had not expected. Breakfast appeared at 8, delivered by a quiet woman named Paula who left the tray and went without conversation, which Sophia appreciated. Enzo was outside the door each morning when she opened it, always in the same dark jacket, always with the same brief nod that seemed to function as both greeting and status report. She had her phone. She had books she had asked Paula to bring from a list she made on the hotel notepad. She had the harbor. What she had not expected was Luca. He came on the second morning with more coffee and a question about a figure in one of Matteo's documents that he wanted to confirm with her. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. He thanked her and left. He came on the third morning with no particular reason that she could identify, sat in the chair by the window, asked whether she had everything she needed, and stayed for 40 minutes talking about something she had mentioned the previous day, that she had studied architectural history briefly before she dropped out of university, and his opinion on a specific building in the Trastevere neighborhood of Rome that she had once written a paper about. He had been there. He had stood in front of the same building. He had different thoughts about it than she did, and he stated them directly, without the performance of agreeing for the sake of pleasantness. And she found herself arguing back with an energy she had not felt in a very long time. He listened while she argued, properly listened, not waiting for her to finish so he could continue his own thought, but actually tracking what she said and responding to it. By the end of the third morning she had forgotten, briefly, precisely why she was in this room. By the end of the first week, she understood something about Luca Ferrante that no newspaper had ever printed, and that his reputation did not suggest. He was a man who was interested in people, not in the calculating way, not cataloging weaknesses or advantages, but genuinely curious about how other human beings thought, and what they cared about, and why. It was unexpected in someone whose world required him to keep other people at a functional distance. She wondered sometimes if that was why he did it, if the curiosity was a way of maintaining something in himself that the rest of his life was constantly trying to flatten. She did not ask him this. She filed it instead. She had always been a filer. It was a habit Matteo had called her greatest strength and her most convenient armor, and he had not been wrong about either. The second week began, and the situation, whatever it was apparently still being resolved. Luca told her this on a Monday morning without elaborating, and she did not ask him to, because she understood by now the shape of the things he would and would not discuss, and the specifics of what he was doing with the information in her brother's documents was firmly in the category of things she was not going to hear about. What she did hear about was his father. It happened on a Tuesday night. A thunderstorm came in from the sea at around 10 in the evening, with the kind of ambition that makes Naples feel very small, and somewhere in the third hour of it, the power went out in the hotel, quietly and completely, the way power does when infrastructure meets weather and weather wins. She had a candle. Paula had left a small emergency kit on the second day, candles and matches and a flashlight, and Sophia lit the candle and sat with it on the small table and looked at the harbor, which was invisible now, just black glass lit occasionally by lightning. A knock at the door. Enzo, she thought, checking on her. She opened the door, and it was Luca with a candle of his own, and he looked at her candle, and she looked at his, and after a moment she stepped back from the door. He came in. They sat across from each other at the small table in the candlelight, while the storm made itself known outside, and he told her, without preamble or apparent reason, about his father. Not the version of the story she might have expected, not the legacy or the inheritance or the weight of a name that preceded every room he walked into. He told her about a man who had wanted, in his youth, to be a pianist, who had practiced every day until he was 17, who had hands, according to everyone who remembered him, that moved on keys the way water moves on glass, with that quality of inevitability. who had been handed instead a different kind of future, by a father who did not believe music was a serious life, and who had put those hands to different uses, and who had never, in 40 years of a very full life, stopped carrying the grief of the thing he had not been allowed to become. He had a piano, Luca said, in the house. He never played it. He kept it tuned. He paid someone to come every year and tune it. It was perfectly tuned for 30 years, and he never once played it. Did you ever ask him why? Once. He said that playing it would confirm that what he had chosen instead was a trade. He preferred to believe it had been necessary, that he hadn't had a choice. Did he have a choice? Luca looked at the candle. No more than your brother did. The storm went on outside. The candle went on between them. Sophia felt the weight of what he had just said, the parallel he had drawn without drawing attention to it, and she understood that this was how Luca Ferranti expressed things he could not say directly, through adjacency, through one story that was quietly also another story. She told him about Matteo then, not the documents, not the system or the debt or the inheritance of obligation. Matteo himself, the way he laughed too early at his own jokes, the card games where he cheated so obviously it was almost charitable, the apology he had given her in his last week, a long and specific list of small things, moments when he had been thoughtless or absent or late, while they both pretended that the large thing was not happening. He apologized for forgetting my birthday in 2019, she said. He was dying and he apologized for missing a birthday 4 years ago. What did you say? I told him I had forgotten it too, which was a lie. I always remember my own birthday, but it seemed important to let him have that one. Luca was quiet for a moment. The people we love are the only real estate worth having, he said. Sophia looked at him. She did not know what to do with that sentence. It was too honest for the room, and too precisely true to dismiss, so she filed it. The way she filed everything that mattered, and held it. The power came back on at midnight. The lights in the room blinked on, mild and warm, and the candle became unnecessary. And Luca stood. You should sleep, he said. You should too. He almost smiled. She watched him go, and after the door closed, she sat at the small table for a long time and looked at the candle, which was still burning, small and steady in the room full of electric light. She understood the secret she had been hiding then, not from him, from herself. She had stayed because of Giada, because of the resolution, because of the practical need to be present while the situation was handled. She had stayed because of the coffee in the morning, and the arguments about buildings, and the man who kept a perfectly tuned piano in a house on a hilltop that she had never seen, and probably never would. She had stayed because Luca Ferrante looked at her the way very few people had ever looked at her, not at the version of herself she maintained for general use, at the actual contents of her. That was the thing she could no longer hide from herself. And she was not at all sure what she was supposed to do with it. She told him she was leaving on a Thursday morning, 16 days after she had fainted in room 412, and changed the entire direction of her life without intending to. The 2 weeks had passed. The matter, Luca had told her 2 days ago, was resolved. The men whose names appeared in Matteo's documents had been removed from their positions through a process she was not informed of, and did not ask about. The accounts connected to her brother's name were being cleared through legal channels that would leave no trace of the original arrangement. Giada's fund had been established. Sophia's employment at the hotel had been quietly transferred to a different property in the city, one that paid better, and did not require her to cover private event wings at midnight. There was no reason to stay. She told him this at breakfast, Thursday morning, with the harbor visible behind her, and the coffee getting cold on the table between them. He listened. He did not argue. He did not try to change her mind. He sat with his coffee and listened to her say that she needed to go back to her apartment and her life, and the version of herself that existed outside this hotel room, and when she finished, he nodded once, the way Enzo nodded, brief and complete. I'll have a car arranged, he said. I can take a cab. I know you can. He stood. I'll have a car arranged. She packed her bag, which had been brought to her from her apartment by Enzo on the second day, and which contained 3 days' worth of practical clothing, and her good book, and the photograph of Matteo she kept in the outer pocket. She looked at the room for a moment, the harbor, the small table, the chair where Luca had sat in the candlelight and told her about a piano that had never been played. She went downstairs. He was waiting in the lobby, which surprised her. She had expected the car and Enzo and a brief professional farewell at the elevator. He walked her to the car himself, past the desk, through the glass doors into the morning. He opened the car door. She stood beside it. "Thank you," she said. "For Giada, for the room, for the coffee, for the way you listen." She did not say any of that specifically. She said thank you, and trusted him to understand, because he was a man who understood things that were not said directly. "You know where I am," he said. She looked at him, directly, the way she had not allowed herself to look at him for most of the past 2 weeks, because direct looking had consequences she had not been prepared to manage. "That's a dangerous thing to know," she said. "Yes," he held her gaze. "But you've always known dangerous things. You're just careful about which ones you carry." She got in the car. She did not look back as it pulled away from the hotel, because looking back was a luxury she could not afford right now, and she had made herself a rule about luxuries she could not afford, which was the same rule she applied to everything that threatened her equilibrium. Don't. She lasted 9 days. 9 days in her apartment, her own bed, her own coffee, her own view of the street below, which was not the harbor, and was not illuminated by fishing boats at 5 in the morning, but was familiar, in the way only the places you have built your life around can be familiar. 9 days of waking up at 7 and going through the motions of her own routine with the efficiency of someone who has done it many times and is no longer entirely present while doing it. 9 days of telling herself she had been practical. She had delivered the documents. She had protected Giada. She had done what her brother asked, and she had exited cleanly, and that was the correct ending. On the 9th night she sat at her kitchen table, where Matteo had sat, and folded his hands and told her what was coming, and she looked at the surface of the table for a long time. She thought about a piano that had been kept perfectly tuned for 30 years and never played, because playing it would confirm that the choice was a trade. She picked up her keys. She drove back to the Hotel Meridian in the 10 o'clock dark, parked on the street outside, and sat in the car for a moment. Then she went in. Enzo was in the lobby. He looked at her with his small nod that covered all situations equally, and she nodded back. "Is he here?" she said. Enzo nodded. "Could you let him know I'd like to speak with him?" Enzo produced his phone. 3 minutes later she was in the corridor outside the same room she had sat in for 16 days, and the door opened, and Luca Ferrante looked at her with the expression of a man who is not surprised, but is going to wait for the person in front of him to say what they came to say before he responds. "I thought of something," Sophia said. "Did you?" "You said I know where you are. You didn't say you'd be willing to be found." Something happened in his face. Slow and warm, and entirely unguarded. The expression of a man who has spent 43 years being very careful, and has just decided, for reasons that are entirely to do with the woman standing in front of him, to be slightly less careful. "Sophia," he said. "Yes? Come in." She went in. The door closed behind her. And the version of herself that had been surviving on invisibility for 3 years, that had kept its head down and its jacket closed and its feelings filed in tidy categories, where they could not cause trouble, set down everything it was carrying. She had tried to hide the secret for 9 days. She had hidden it for exactly as long as she could. Some things are not made for hiding. They are made for the moment when the body decides, without consulting the mind, that the effort of containment exceeds the capacity to contain. She had already fainted once in this hotel. She was not going to let the second thing she couldn't hold go that quietly. She sat down. Luca poured 2 cups of coffee with the ease of a man who had been doing it every morning for 16 days. And Sophia Reyes, who had come into this place with a dead man's last act of love folded against her ribs, and who had left with a living thing growing where the grief had been, looked at the window where the harbor was dark and far below and beginning, just beginning, at the very edge of the eastern sky, to turn toward light. She picked up the cup. She stayed.